good to see everyone. Glad you're all able to be here. Hopefully we won't get too wet before we get back home tonight. The class tonight may prove to be interesting because I've never taught a class before where the whole subject matter was one word. And so normally in times past, if I'd have had to teach a class that the whole subject matter was one word, it would have lasted most of 30 seconds. So we'll see what happens tonight. Our text is in Galatians Chapter 5, beginning in verse 19. Let's see. Oh, I'm in the wrong chapter. No wonder it didn't look right. It's a little confusing to me because I normally read out the New King James Bible, and these lessons are taken from the King James Version of the Bible. So I've been back and forth between 2 or 3 Bibles this week studying for this class, so it's not all looking just right to me at the moment. In Galatians chapter 5, beginning verse 19, it says, "Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I also told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God." In the New King James here, instead of the word lasciviousness, which is the word we're studying tonight, it used the word lewdness, uncleanness and lewdness. So as we go through in different translations, read that in different ways. It says, the Amplified Version says, "Now the doings or practices of the flesh are clear. They're obvious. They are immorality, impurity, indecency." It uses instead of the word lascivious there. The New American Standard Version of the Bible uses the word sensuality. And the New International Version uses the word debauchery. So we can see that word's been translated several different ways, and all of those words have a very similar meaning. When we think about the definition of the word lasciviousness, it says here that Strong's says it has to do with not exercising restraint in relation to the desires or passions. It uses the word licentiousness. It also says filthy, lasciviousness, or wantonness. And in Vine's definition, it says it has to do with an absence of restraint, indecency, wantonness. The prominent idea is shameless conduct. And then I looked up a couple of different places online for a definition of the word lasciviousness. It says it has to do with debauchery, sensuality, depravity, unbridled lust, shamelessness. And Thayer's definition says it has to do with indecent bodily movements, filthy words. I might not be able to talk all the way through tonight. Unchaste handling of males and females has to do with evil, perversion, a lacking of moral restraints, especially sexually. Has to do with lewdness or wanton thoughts, especially of objects or pictures. And so as we think about the definition of lasciviousness, there's a lot of things in here that can come to our mind. It's got a lot to do, I think, as we look at these different words, has to do with sexual type sins, where it talks about the debauchery or the sensuality or the unbridled lust. I think where it talks about depravity here, it could be talking about unnatural desires, when we would think of maybe, as we mentioned a lot of these things last week when we talked about fornication, it would have to do with a lot of unnatural desires like bestiality or homosexuality and things like that, or even molesting children. It talks about, in some of the definitions I looked up on the internet, it had to do with a lot of things to do with being abusive toward children that way. The word shamelessness really, it kind of stuck out to me a lot. So I think one of the things that came to my mind when I thought about shamelessness is it had to do with the actions that people do that they're not ashamed of. They don't have any sense of shame related to what they're doing or the evils that they're doing. And sometimes I think a lot of these things we get involved in not realizing what we're doing. I think this shamelessness could probably even carry over maybe even to the way we dress when we think of dressing modestly or dressing properly and the not exposing our nakedness. As we studied the Bible, we've studied it often before and we'll probably do it often again. Nakedness has to do with anything basically from about right here down to my knees. It shouldn't be exposed. As we look through definitions and things that are described as revealing nakedness, especially in the Old Testament, we can read about it. We can see what God looked at as exposing our nakedness. And so when that's shamelessness, if we're dressing in a way that's exposing parts of our bodies that shouldn't be seen by others, then we're behaving shamelessly. We don't have the proper sense of shame. I think the word in one passage the King James uses a lot is shamefacedness. We should have a sense of propriety about us that we wouldn't want to expose ourselves to anyone else. I think the Bible maybe teaches a certain few exceptions, maybe for a medical reason or something. We might have to be, someone may have to see parts of us that normally we shouldn't expose. But really that's about the extent of it. So we should not be shameless. As we think about where Thayer talked about indecent bodily movement, what come to my mind on that is the modern dance. And a lot of people will send their kids to the prom and say, oh, it's their prom, it's their senior prom or their junior prom or whatever prom it is. They only get to do this once in their life. Like that's okay. That makes it okay. But of any of the dancing that I've had the misfortune of seeing in the last great number of years, the dances were vulgar. I mean, the bodily movements, I've heard it described as basically having sex with your clothes on. And from what little bit I've seen of it, because we don't have outside TV, so it's the very few movies that we rent, and it doesn't have that in it. But I remember back when I was growing up, in the 60s, when I was born in 61, I remember back then, there was a show come on, I think every Saturday morning, called American Bandstand. Had Dick Clark in it. And anyhow, basically what that was, they played whatever the current modern popular music was at the time, and people were dancing to it. And it's been a long time ago since I seen that, but as well as I can remember, the motions that they went through in those movies, even back then, weren't particularly decent. I mean, they were vulgar, they were suggestive. And then as I got older, on up into the 70s, I remember there was a show that came on. What was the name of that? Solid Gold. And they had the Solid Gold dancers on there. And it was basically the same thing, except that it wasn't so much that they had just the average run-of-the-mill person out there dancing. They had professional dancers over there, and they were extra vulgar. I can remember that. And they were really indecent. And so when we think about it, the modern dances that people would like to and do participate in nowadays are vulgar. They're very suggestive. The movements are lewd. And that falls under lasciviousness. So ultimately, I know there was a guy I was working with one time. He was talking about his daughter going to the prom. I said, oh, so you're sending her to the lasciviousness party. And he didn't particularly like what I had to say about it, but I wasn't going to back down because I was right. But the idea is I don't think any of us are prone to going to dances. At my age, I probably don't have the coordinated enough movements. If I wanted to dance to be able to do a decent job of it, it would be like something you'd think of seeing Gomer Pyle do back when that was on TV. But anyway, we shouldn't be sending our children. We shouldn't be allowing our children to do that. When we think of a minute ago, we was talking about the shamelessness, the dress. We need to be monitoring and aware of what our children are dressing, what they're wearing. I remember when our kids was at home, especially if our grandkids or if my kids went to go stay with their grandmother, she would buy them clothes that weren't decent. So when they come back home, we had to go through the stuff they brought home with them and throw a bunch of it away. And so we need to be aware of what our children is dressing, because if our children are living at home with us and they leave the home dressed in a way that exposes part of their nakedness, we're responsible for that lasciviousness, that indecentness that they're doing. We've allowed it, we've permitted it, condoned it by letting them do it. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to maybe go through their clothes from time to time, and if there's something there they shouldn't be wearing, throw it in the trash and get rid of it, because we don't want to be held accountable. We don't want to even be promoting that kind of clothes, because we don't want our children, when they get older, you think about it, training in this kind of thing needs to start when they're really little. If we've got our little kids wearing really short dresses, the little girls look cute in these little short dresses. They look real frilly and all that. They look cute. But if they're exposing what the Bible describes as exposing their nakedness, where do you draw the line? You tell the kids when they're little, it's okay when you're 3 to do it, but now that they're 12, you can't dress like that no more. Well, why? What changed? Well, the rules didn't change. It's just that we decided to make a difference at that point. And so what we have to do is be consistent all the way throughout. When they're little, don't let them wear that stuff. And then when they're grown, it ain't a big battle you got to fight. All their life they haven't been wearing that stuff. So it's easier to take a stand when they're little that way and stay with it. The dancing had to do with the indecent bodily movements. I'm not saying that necessarily that all dancing is that way. I'm sure that somewhere in the world there's dancing that's probably not vulgar. But I don't think it's dancing that probably anybody in today's society is interested in doing. The people that go to dances don't go for that. That's not what they're there for. They're there for the excitement that's involved in it. I know as a guy, I've never been to a dance. And it wasn't that when I was in high school I was a moral giant and said, no, that's wrong and I'm not going to do it. When I was in high school, that just wasn't something I'd done. I was more interested in going hunting and fishing. I didn't have no desire to go dancing. I was too busy with other things for that. But if I had been going to the dance, I would have been going for the thrill that I would have got out of watching all them girls out there shucking and jiving and doing their thing and wiggling and jiggling. I mean, when it talks about indecent bodily movements, that's what it's talking about. And so we need to be really careful about that. And I know in our society today, it's hard not to go places where you're going to see that. I mean, you go to Walmart and you're going to see people dressed indecent. You just will, because that's the way people are in our society. And we'll talk about that some more in a few minutes before we get through the class. But anyhow, we can't, as Paul said, we can't, if we was going to be completely away from these kind of things, we'd have to leave the world, and we can't do that. That's not an option for us. But we do have to limit our exposure. Let's see. There's this idea of unchaste handling. It talks about, I remember as a kid growing up in the church over at Oak Avenue, and Billy Ashworth was there preaching, and he was talking about petting, and I didn't have a clue what he was talking about petting. That word didn't register with me in the time frame that I was growing up. But basically that has to do with putting our hands on people at places that they shouldn't be. Groping and fondling and things like that. And that's what he's talking about with this unchaste handling part of that definition. We shouldn't be touching people places that we shouldn't be. And in my mind, I'm kind of convinced that it might be possible that, especially as a young man with raging hormones, it might be lasciviousness for me to hold hands with a girl. If I was so wound up that holding her hands sent me and my eyes rolled back in my head and I about passed out because of the excitement that went with it, I probably engaged in lasciviousness at that point. I'm reasonably confident, could about guarantee you that for me to have kissed a young girl at that time would have been lasciviousness, because I know my eyes would have rolled back in my head and I'd about passed out then. So we need to be really careful, and especially when we think about these things, teaching our children things that they shouldn't be doing. Because as we talked about fornication last week, this lasciviousness business, if it's not in some respects not included in fornication, it's a direct step right before it. These things that we do, like we was talking about, the unchaste handling, the indecent bodily movements, all these things right there are stepping stones up to fornication. So we've got to be really careful what we're doing. It talked about filthy words, using dirty language, talking dirty to each other. That would include listening to dirty jokes or telling dirty jokes. We shouldn't be doing that. The Bible tells us to keep every filthy communication out of our mouth. So we've got to be really careful about the language that we use. We don't need to be talking and telling dirty jokes. If people where we're at telling dirty jokes, we probably need to get up and leave the room, because we don't need to be hearing that kind of stuff too. And we'll talk about that some more when we get down here about, let's see, in Ephesians chapter 4, when it talks about, no, that ain't it. Somewhere in this lesson we'll talk about. I've done read it too many times and confused. But nevertheless, we need to avoid these kind of things. If it's something that's going to put these kind of thoughts in our mind, it's going to promote the ideas in our mind, we need to avoid them. We need to get away from them. The Bible tells us to flee youthful lust. A lot of these sexual sins that we talk about here, we typically think of being youthful lust. Now, older people aren't immune from them. We've all known of people that we thought was really spiritual leaders in the church that have fallen away, preachers that have committed adultery, left their wives. and things like that, and preachers or elders or just more mature people that we thought would be stronger than that fall into these kind of things. So it's not just youthful lust. I'm assuming until the time we finally get around to dying, we're going to have to be careful about this kind of stuff because it's not going to entirely go away from us. Let's see. Talks about lacking moral restraints, especially sexually. You know, I think in our culture today, that's an especially big problem, is lacking people that lack moral restraints. And morals has more to do with just sexual activity. It has to do with really every aspect of good and evil that we deal with in our lives. If we're prone to lying, that's an immoral activity. It's outside the moral boundaries that God has set for us. But it talks about lacking moral restraints is part of the definition of lasciviousness, especially sexually. And I'm amazed as I deal with people that I work with in first one thing or another, how easy people are to just go hop in the bed with somebody new. And when I was growing up, if you was fooling around that way, at least you felt like you need to sneak around about it and be quiet about it. You didn't want everybody in the world to know about it. Well, now people don't care. It's just our world has got to the point that there are basically no moral restraints, even about sexual things. It's, you know, I've heard a thing one time where some women were talking about, these were more high society women, at least in their minds, but they was talking about this particular person they was married to was a good first marriage. They looked at marriage as a stepping stone to get where they wanted to be in the social circle or financially or whatnot like that. So they didn't really have any restraints in that regard either. They was just using that relationship for a stepping stone or to promote their own desires. They wasn't doing it with what mind was doing, doing what was right. Talks about lewd or wanton thoughts, and it said especially toward objects or pictures. And I think that part of the definition would fall into what we understand as pornography. We need to be really careful about that. And in when this was written, I don't know so much that I think that people, I know they didn't have internet because it's really easy to find pornography on the internet. You'll find it by accident. You can be searching for whatever. I know one time Tina was searching for some wallpaper. She's really into interior decorating and design and that kind of stuff. And she typed in some kind of wallpaper, something, I don't remember what it was, and all of a sudden there was a bunch of naked people on the screen. So she had to try to get out of that real quick. So you can find it when you're not looking for it. I mean, it's there, and we know that. I think probably during the time this first century was written, the letters was written here to them, it wasn't as simple necessarily to find pornography like the way we think of it. It talks about objects or pictures or portraits. But that kind of thing, these activities were prominent in the idol temples. As Greg talked about last week, fornication was an act of worship in these idol temples quite often. And they might be people that would say, I would never cheat on my wife. I would never go somewhere and participate in those kind of activities. I just wouldn't do it. I know it's wrong. It never happened. Well, I suspect that there were people in the first century that had that same attitude, that would have never cheated on their wife, but they might go to the idol temple and watch other people doing it. So we think, well, they didn't have pornography, like we've got it now, but they had it in other ways that they could have viewed it. And so they had to be careful with it. They were warned about it, and we have to be careful of it too. Especially, realistically, I was in Walmart the other day and got me a sweatshirt. And to go through the aisles where the clothing is, these pictures up there of women that are in their underwear and that's all they've got on. Realistically, 40 or 50 years ago, that would have been considered pornography. But now it's right out in the open for everybody to see. So it's really hard to completely and entirely avoid it. But as I walk through that area to go get me another pair of sweatshirts or a pair of pants or whatever I've got to get in these stores that has that kind of stuff up, I don't have to dwell on them pictures. I know they're there. I don't have to look for them. I can avoid them to a great extent. Maybe not entirely, but to a great extent I can. I don't have to focus on them and train my thoughts on them. I can think about other things. So as we think about lasciviousness and all these things that it has to do with, there was another one I was going to look at here. Let's see. Talked about unbridled lust. It has to do with uncontrolled lust. It's basically a lack of self-control that people are engaging in here. They're not even trying to control themselves. And so we've got to be careful to control ourselves, to control the things we think about. because as we read down through here where it talks about it, the first scripture we'll turn to is Mark chapter 7, verse 22. Mark chapter 7, verse 22. If I get to running too fast, if anybody's got a comment, speak up. We'll start reading at verse 20. This is Jesus talking. He's saying, what comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, which would be also our word lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, and foolishness. And all these evil things come from within and defile a man. So what I was thinking about here as I read this, the question here, it says, where does lasciviousness come from? It comes from the heart. It comes from out of our heart. It's something that we think about. Because what we think about is what we are. And so what we have to learn to do is to not think about these things. We're going to have to put other things in there. Wade?
Yeah, one of the things that you were saying a while ago about that they might go to watch other people do those things. In Romans chapter 1, verse 32, it says, although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things, and he's been talking about homosexuality, are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give part of the fruit to those who practice them. So I think that kind of comes into what you were saying about watching.
I think some translations in that passage where yours says give approval to, says take pleasure in. And so it's that same idea. It might be that I wouldn't necessarily commit this sin myself, it's the fornication or whatever, but I might go watch somebody else do it and enjoy it. And if I'm watching somebody else and enjoying it, or whatever I had to do that, I'm promoting that myself. I'm supporting them in it. And so I'm responsible to some extent for what they're doing. I'll be participating with it if I go and watch it and enjoy it. John?
Sin in general is going to be a choice. We're all going to make choices about what we do, what we say, what we think, how we say what we do. And all that stuff is a choice made. God said in 1 Corinthians 10:15, no temptation is overcome you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with that temptation, He will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure.
Yeah.
So there's a way for you to avoid the sin that comes along with these things that you see, the things that you hear, the things that are so prevalent around. Like you said, you're aware of, you walk in Walmart or wherever, you're aware of those pictures up there. But you make a concerted choice to not observe, not look at them, not dwell on them, not pay them any attention, but to move on and do what you've got to do, looking straight ahead. As the Bible says, it's a choice. And we need to, gird ourselves, as the Bible says, and also make those choices that are going to be in line with what we profess to be as God's children.
Everything that we do in life we do it because we chose to. Sometimes something may come up and you say, well, I couldn't help it. I didn't have a choice. You had a choice. You could have said no. As John said, the Bible clearly tells us that God has provided a way of escape to overcome temptations. We might not can help being tempted. Jesus was tempted, it says, in all points just like we are. So being tempted by something is not a sin. But giving in to that temptation is. And so that's what we've got to be careful of. And the things that we do are choices. You might say, well, somebody's holding a gun to my head. If I didn't do it, they're going to kill me. Well, then you chose to do that sin rather than get killed at that time. That was a choice you made. And so we've got to make up our minds that we're going to do right and that we're going to choose to do the right things and then do it no matter what. Because there's worse things than dying. If we're a faithful Christian and die, we're going to heaven. If we give in to that temptation at the last and make a poor choice and then die, then we're not going to heaven. Wade?
And I think the scriptures talk, and I'm trying to remember the passage that talks about how we shouldn't put ourselves in situations where we aren't tempted. Because we just like I said, we make our own choices. Sometimes our choices are put us there where we're tempted, where we can, sin. And so, I don't know if that's maybe a sin to do that, but it's obviously a poor choice to try to put yourself in that situation.
I mean, when you think of it, we know it's wrong to drink alcohol. If I don't go any place that alcohol is served, it's very unlikely I'm going to drink any alcohol. But if that's my weakness, if I'm an alcoholic and I go to the bar and say, well, I'm just going to go hang out with my friends, but I'm not going to drink, it's almost certain that before you leave there, you're going to be drinking because you've put yourself in the middle of that temptation. So it's one of the questions I was trying to find a minute ago and couldn't find it, but it has to do with the idea of how do we overcome these things? Well, a lot of things we avoid. We just don't go where that temptation is. I wouldn't go places where there was alcohol served. I don't drink and I never have, but I still wouldn't go there because I know that in my family line in the past there's been alcoholics, so that may be a genetic trait, so to speak, that I have. I don't know, but if I don't go places where that's served, then I'm not going to be drinking, and I don't have to worry about whether that's a weakness for me. I don't, and it's the same thing with this idea of lasciviousness, all these immoralities that it suggested, the wantonness, the debauchery, the sensuality. I can avoid those kind of things in my life. I don't have to look for them. When I know that it's going to be that way, like going to a dance, I've heard people say, well, I'm going to go to the prom, but I'm not going to dance. Oh, so you're just going to go watch other people do it and get stirred up by it. No, I can avoid that. I don't have to go at all. Kelly?
I think Greg had a really good lesson a few months ago about making provision for the flesh. Maybe the verse Wade was looking for, Romans 13:14, making a provision for the flesh.
Yeah. That's the idea of we know that there's things that we're going to be tempted for. Some of the things we're tempted by is just human nature. It's the way it is. And we know that, but we have to learn to avoid those things and not make provision for them. Just like where it says flee in youthful lust. I can stay away from those kind of things. I can choose where I go and don't go. Nobody's making me go anywhere. They're not handcuffing me and throwing me in the truck and dragging me off and plopping me in the middle of these things that's going to cause temptations. So I can avoid them. I can go away and stay away from those things. But when we understand these things come from our heart, Jesus said these ideas and this lasciviousness comes from our heart. So what that's telling me is sometimes I've got to change my attitude about things. And I think one of the reasons a lot of things are temptations for us that they are is because of our attitude. And we don't have the attitude. God talks about things that are an abomination to Him. Well, something that's an abomination is something that's terrible and disgusting to us, makes us sick to our stomach, want to throw up. That's the idea of abomination. These sinful activities that we're trying to avoid, our problem a lot of times is they're not an abomination to us. They're actually something that sounds kind of appealing to us. That would be fun. I would like that if I did it, maybe. And rather than having this attitude, this is disgusting, I ain't going to do it, if we're not careful, we've got the attitude, boy, I wish I could do that, but I know it's a sin. But I'd sure love to do it if it wasn't a sin. Well, we need to change our attitude about it. We need to develop that attitude God has about these things, that they're disgusting to Him and that we don't want to do it. And that's part of our problem. Sometimes this question says, how can we overcome and avoid the sin of lasciviousness? Well, first off, the first word that came to my mind was to repent. We're taught that repentance is a change of heart sufficient to change the mind. We need to change our attitude. We need to repent. Make a commitment. I'm not going to do this anymore, and then don't do it. Stick firmly to that commitment. As we mentioned a minute ago, sometimes we've got to change friends. If the people that we've been hanging out with all along are prone to doing these sinful activities, we have to understand that that's going to tend to lead us, we're going to want to fit in with them, that's going to tend to lead us to do those same things. So we might have to change friends. We're not going to go the places we used to go. We're not going to hang out with the people we used to hang out with because they're going to lead us in a bad direction. And so that's a couple of ways that came to my mind about how we can avoid the sin of lasciviousness. We make that firm commitment that we're not going to do it, and then we avoid as many as possible opportunities that would give us to participate in it. Let's turn to Romans chapter 13 and verse 13. And here the Apostle Paul says, let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry, in drunkenness, not in lewdness or lasciviousness, and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust. And so Romans 13:13 is telling us that we're supposed to walk properly. Well, if we're participating in lasciviousness, we're not walking properly. Some of the things that it associates here with lasciviousness, it says, is revelry, which has the idea of wild parties. Drunkenness, we understand what that is. Then lewdness, it says here, or lasciviousness, that's associated with lust, and also strife and envy. And so all of these things are bad things, and we're commanded not to participate in them. Well, it tells us we're supposed to make a change in our life when we become a Christian and stay away from these things. Wade? Okay. Yeah. And so that idea of making no provision for means when we know that this is a problem, and lasciviousness is a temptation and a problem for everyone. So when we know that, then we're going to do things. We're not going to provide to make it easy to fall into and give into this temptation, but we're going to do things to make it hard to fall into that temptation and be carried away by it. And so we're not going to provide for that to fulfill the lust that we have. Says the King James Version in this passage, instead of using the word lasciviousness, used the word chambering. And when I looked up a definition for chambering, it was a similar definition. It says wantonness, impurity, sexual immorality, and lewdness. And ultimately, apparently the original definition for that type of word or the concept had to do with when a man and wife got married back in the first century. It was the responsibility of the best man to provide, and sometimes nowadays, the bride's family pays for the honeymoon. Well, it was the responsibility of the best man to provide a place for the couple to go to consummate their marriage. And so that idea of chambering here has to do, in this context, with providing for a place to go participate in immoral activities. And so we need to avoid that. As we mentioned about not making no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust, we're not going to make provision. We're not going to find places to go. I know when I was younger, people referred to it as going parking. They'd go out someplace and park out in the country somewhere in their vehicle so that they could do things they shouldn't be doing. And so one way to avoid that is don't go parking. Don't go places you shouldn't go. Don't be alone with other people. You know, if you know that you've got a really big temptation in that regard, then be around other people. And that way you're not going to be doing those kinds of things. All right. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 21. Paul's talking to the Corinthians here. He says, lest when I come again, my God will humble me among you, and I shall mourn for many who have sinned before and have not repented of the uncleanness, fornication, lasciviousness which they have practiced. So he's telling these people here that they had been engaged in these activities, these lasciviousness activities, and they hadn't repented of them. We talked a minute ago about getting rid of it and repenting, changing their life. They hadn't made the change they needed to. It's linked in this verse, it says here, with the word uncleanness. And I looked up the word uncleanness. It said impurity, lustful, profligate living, which has to do with a wild, immoral lifestyle, impure motives, and moral filthiness. So when it's talking about these things here, this word lasciviousness is really and truly associated with every filthy thing that we really shouldn't want in our life. Everything that we should be trying to get away from. Let's turn to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 19. Ephesians 4:19 says, who being past feeling have given themselves over to lewdness or lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. And so the idea here again is that people have seared their conscience to the point that they think these kind of things are okay. And says they're past feeling. They've seared their conscience and they've given themselves over to these things. And it says about working all uncleanness with greediness. The question here says, explain how lasciviousness and uncleanness are related to greediness. And my thought on that had to do with like being addicted to something. I've heard and read that the addiction to pornography is the fastest growing addiction in the United States. It's just growing by leaps and bounds, people being addicted to it. And when we think of being addicted to something, when we think of a drug addict, he maybe started with a little bit, and then that got to where that didn't satisfy him anymore, and then he had to go with a bigger amount and a larger amount and a larger amount until they're just overcome with it. The idea of they can't get enough of it. They can't get enough of this drug to satisfy themselves. And this lasciviousness and uncleanness is the same way. That's my understanding of it, that when a person gets started in this, maybe they just found it by accident sometime, then the next thing you know, they're going back to it, and they're going back to it, and they're going back to it, to the point that talks, from what I read, they spend hours and hours looking at this kind of stuff on the internet or whatever. They're addicted to it, and they can't get enough. And so we need to be careful about that and understand what it leads to. Just like the alcoholic didn't start out drinking a fifth of whiskey every night. He started out with one drink, and it progressed to that. And I used to work with a guy that on the way home from work every day, he would drink a 12-pack of beer, and then he had a fifth of whiskey that he drank that night. And that was every day's business on the way home from work. And so I'm sure he didn't start out at that great excess, but he got to be that way for him. And so we need to understand, I think what he's telling us here is that if you're not careful, you're going to get plumb off in the middle of this and not know how to get out. And so stay away from it to begin with, and you don't have to worry about it so much. Let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3. First Peter 4, verse 3 says, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries." And so he's telling us here that some of these people this letter was being written to had participated in these things in the past. But he said, that should have been enough. I mean, you shouldn't have to keep going on this. This shouldn't have to be an ongoing thing for you. When you repented and became a Christian, that was enough. You didn't need to do it anymore. And so we need to understand that too, that however much that we had done that in the past, that was plenty. We don't need any more. It's something we should have never done to begin with. But he also talks about, apparently these people had been really wrapped up in it to the point in verse 4 it says, in regard to these, talking about people that knew him, says, in regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. So if we're living properly and avoiding this sin of lasciviousness, the people of the world are going to think we're weird. And they're not really going to have maybe, and hopefully not going to want to have as much to do with us in some respects because we don't fit in with them anymore. To me, that's what really stood out to me, is they're going to think we're weird and we don't fit in with them anymore. We shouldn't want to be the kind of people that fits in. We're called to be different. We're called to be set apart. And if we're going to be different and set apart, then we're going to have a different lifestyle than the people around us are having. Let's turn to 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 7. Yes.
I think that's an important point because you see a lot of people that, call themselves Christians, but they try to, and I think we all probably do this to some extent, depending on what it is, but we always try to walk that line, of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And it's easy, I think, for a lot of people, especially when you're talking about this kind of stuff, because it's so prevalent in the world. Just like I said, wherever you go, there's pictures all over the place, and it's just accepted. And so as Christians, even among our own brethren, if we take a certain position on modesty, that we should be modest, I think we get persecuted by our own brethren sometimes, that we take that position. Because, if you go anywhere, it's like at Walmart, anywhere, people are just showing the body off.
Yeah.
So.
And we do have to be really careful about that because it does tend to, it kind of gets in amongst us if we're not careful, and we get to where we're desensitized to it, and it don't mean so much to us anymore. I know a place we used to worship, some of the young girls, when they would go to the prom, they'd bring their prom pictures and show to one of the elders at the church there, and he'd ooh and ah over it with them. That was sort of an accepted thing. That's what people did. So we've got to be really careful to understand what these things mean and to avoid them and not be taken by them to any extent. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 7 says, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. This filthy conduct here has to do with the idea of lasciviousness here. What they were doing in Sodom, the Bible tells us, as we read back through that, it was really rampant with homosexuality. That was a form of lasciviousness that he was talking about, and talked about how Lot was vexed by that. His attitude was, I don't like this, I don't want to be around it, and y'all people need to quit doing this, because they accused him of trying to be a judge over them. Let's turn to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 18. It says, for they speak great swelling words of emptiness, and they allure through the lust of the flesh, through lewdness, the ones who have actually escaped from those who live in error. So he's talking about people here that were clean, that had become Christians, but they might be lured back in by these kind of activities. Because when you've had a taste of these things, or even when you haven't, they are temptations and they do look appealing to you. So he's telling us we got to be really careful, because even though we're Christians and living right, we can stumble here. We can be lured back in by it. And then let's go to Jude not chapter 4, but Jude verse 4. It says, for certain men have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were marked out for this condemnation, ungodly men who turn the grace of our God into lewdness or lasciviousness, and deny the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. So the people he's describing here are false teachers, and the question here is, how might one turn the grace of God into lasciviousness? We know that in the first century, the Judaizing teachers was trying to bring their Jewish practices into the church. And I think it's very reasonable to understand that probably the people that came out of idolatry into the church were trying to bring their idolatrous practices in too. And as we've talked about, fornication was part of these idolatrous practices quite often. And so it's easy to see, if you thought that was a good thing and a worship thing, how you would try to bring that over with you, because they didn't have a proper understanding of what was involved there. And so we need to be very careful about that too, that we're not letting inappropriate things come into our worship, things that we don't have authority for. Appreciate your help and attention to the lesson tonight.